Hey everybody, I'm Pastor Joshua Sullivan at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Kerrville, Texas. Welcome back to another episode of ATP, Ask the Pastor. Real quick before we get started, if there's something you'd like to ask the pastor, you can email me, atpholycross@gmail.com, and I will get to your email as soon as I'm able. All right, today's question, dear pastor, what are the differences between the doctrine of the Holy Ministry and the WELS, the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, and the Missouri Synod? All right, so the Missouri Synod teaches that Christ instituted a specific office whose duty it is to preach and teach the gospel, to forgive and retain sins, to baptize, and to administer the Lord's Supper. The Wisconsin Synod teaches that Christ instituted a public ministry that consists of preaching and teaching the gospel, forgiving and retaining sins, baptizing and administering the Lord's Supper, but that these tasks belong to the church corporately and to each member of the church individually. So the WELS 1969 Theses on Church and Ministry, state, Christ instituted one office in his church, the ministry of the gospel. It is the task of proclaiming the gospel in word and sacrament. This office or service, the ministry of the keys, has been given to the church, i.e., to the believers individually and collectively. So for Wisconsin, the one office, or the ministry of the gospel, which Christ instituted in his church, is the task of proclaiming the gospel in word and sacrament. So for Wisconsin, Christ didn't institute a specific form on how the church was to perform this task. The form the ministry takes is malleable. It depends upon the context. Wisconsin confesses this in the Theses as well. There is, however, no direct word of institution for any particular form of the public ministry. The one public ministry of the gospel may assume various forms as circumstances demand. The ministry of the gospel, then, it consists of certain tasks or functions, which is why we often call the WELS doctrine of the ministry functionalism. And all of these tasks are possessed by every Christian by virtue of baptism and faith. So this identifies the ministry of the gospel with the priesthood of all believers. So essentially, there's no difference between pastors and hearers. Thesis 2D confesses this public ministry is not generically different from that of the common priesthood of all Christians. It constitutes a special God-ordained way of practicing the one ministry of the gospel. Now, this doesn't mean, however, that just anybody can stand up and publicly preach, teach, forgive and retain sins, or administer the sacraments. Thesis 2D goes on under subpoint 1 to say, all Christians are equal before God, neither superior nor inferior to one another, and all are equally entrusted with the same ministry of the gospel, 1 Peter 2:9. Hence, no one may assume the functions of the public ministry except through a legitimate call. So it is the divine call which brings shape to the ministry of the gospel that all Christians inherently and abstractly possess. The divine call, it concretizes the ministry of the gospel into specific forms, which, as we heard, can vary as circumstances demand. So what does this look like in reality? Well, a congregation can extend a divine call to a man to serve as its pastor, and he will exercise all of the functions of the public ministry. That same congregation can extend a divine call to school teachers to teach the gospel in their classrooms, but also to teach things like math, science, history, and the like. The divine call excludes teachers, school teachers, from publicly baptizing and administering the Lord's Supper. Now, that same congregation then can call Sunday school teachers to teach the gospel to the congregation's children for 1 hour a week. Even Vacation Bible School teachers then receive a divine call to teach at VBS if they're not already divinely called grade school teachers. If the divinely called pastor of the congregation then decides to take a vacation, that congregation can issue a temporary call to one of the laymen of the congregation to preach and administer the sacraments during the duration of the pastor's absence. Since it's the divine call that brings form and shape to the ministry of the word publicly, the form can change based on the circumstances. And in this way of thinking about the ministry, it's theoretically possible that you have women performing functions of the ministry that Scripture prohibits. Consider the words of WELS seminary professor John Brooke. The Lord's Supper, since it is a public act of the church, is normally administered by the pastor of the congregation. Therefore, it would not normally be administered by a woman. It is conceivable that it might be administered by a properly trained and called woman in a congregation which consisted entirely of women that could not be served by a pastor, such as a women's prison or an underground congregation of women in an Islamic country. That a woman could administer the Lord's Supper to a group of women, that's just simply the natural outworking of Wisconsin's understanding of the ministry of the word as a task, which takes various forms depending upon the circumstances. Or, as John Schaller wrote, that the preaching of the gospel takes place is essential, but how it takes place is incidental and depends on the circumstances of the congregation and on the opportunity. Now, the Missouri Synod, on the other hand, as we said at the beginning, holds that the office of the public ministry is the pastoral office, and it is the only office instituted by Christ in his church. And Christ assigned specific duties to that office: preaching and teaching the gospel, forgiving and retaining sins, baptizing and administering the Lord's Supper. Missouri also teaches Missouri teaches that these functions of the office are not given to all believers by virtue of their baptism and faith. So the priesthood of believers is not the same thing as possessing the ministry in the abstract as it is in the WELS. Now, Missouri approaches the Wisconsin position, however, when we get to Missouri's teaching about the auxiliary offices. So Missouri holds that the church possesses the freedom to create other offices by human institution from time to time to assist in carrying out the functions of the pastoral ministry. And they list such offices as teacher, director of Christian education, director of Christian outreach, parish worker, and others that the Synod recognizes and provides official training for. So this is like the Wisconsin position in that people are divinely called into these auxiliary offices to perform specific functions of the office of the ministry. And they're a part of, then, the office of the ministry. This is why parochial school teachers in the Missouri Synod are often divinely called positions. Missouri sees the classroom teacher as an extension of the office of the ministry, not as the office of parent, like Luther does in the Large Catechism, section 1, paragraph 141. What differentiates this from the Wisconsin position is that these offices are rooted in the one office of the ministry, rather than they are manifestations of an abstract ministry, which all Christians possess by virtue of faith in their baptism. Overall, Missouri's position is closer to Scripture and that of the Lutheran confessions than the Wisconsin Synod's position is. But Missouri's position still isn't entirely in line with Scripture. Missouri is correct in that Christ instituted one office of the ministry with certain duties. But Missouri's wrong in parsing out those duties to auxiliary offices that are part of the ministry, but not the pastoral ministry itself. I think it's best to say if Christ instituted the office of the ministry with its specific duties, it would be more faithful and much easier to understand if the church simply called qualified men to serve as pastors, and those are the ones that perform the duties that Christ gave the ministry to do. Hope this helps. We'll see you next time for another episode of ATP Ask the Pastor.